You say you want a revolution. Well, you know. We all want to change the world.
People, the minds that hate.
Here are your pictures of Chen and Mao.
Ain't
We're gonna make it with anyone anyhow.
They say it's gonna be alright. Alright.
All right, vocal stylings of the Pill Pod.
Revolution.
We have a reduced cast today due to internet technology failing us. So here with us at the moment, and this may expand as the hour goes on, but here with us at the moment, we have Semiotics Guy.
We're dropping in for a talk about revolution.
We need like a shout out from you.
Yeah, it's on my, it's recorded.
And returning was a guest, is no longer a guest, is Matt McManus. Matt, you passed the test on your first try. So what do you say about being a member of the Pill Pod?
I think it's fucking A. You know what I mean? I've always felt that I should be here. And in fact, I resented not being part of the crew originally. So really, this is an injustice that's been rectified.
Well, if you couldn't tell from our vocal rendition at the start of the cast, we are talking about revolution and how we all want to change the world through posting.
Yeah.
Just to let you inside what happens in the world of podcasting, we had a failed podcast last week where it was 2 hours in, everybody was off topic. We were going on and on about the dialectic of recognition and the historical dialectic and which one we should be focusing on. So this is us reining everything back in, and we're going to specify to try to recover material if possible. We just want to talk about revolution, the concept of revolution, what revolution means, and what to do, you know, in the post-Bernie age when everybody had a lot of hopes, thinking, oh, the richest, one of the richest nations on earth is about to elect somebody who resembles leftist values. So what do we do if we're going to call ourselves leftist? And that's a big if, but we're leaning that way. And what do we do with the notion of revolution from a philosophical or critical theory perspective, given the climate that we are now sitting in?
And the literal climate that is deteriorating around us. Is it urgent?
Oh, that reminds me. I take responsibility. Mr. White.
We're all in this together. Imagine all the people.
Matt, you have like 2,000 Twitter followers or something, so I think you should take responsibility too. I will take responsibility for the universal subject and for abjecting other identities throughout history, beginning in, 15th to 16th century. I'll take responsibility for universal subjects.
Hey, listen, I already sit there every single day and I try to look at guillotines on Amazon, but they just don't really meet my style, right? They're aesthetically graceless. They're kind of crude and stuff. I need to find one that has a little bit of panache to go full Jacobin. One day.
It's a little too fancy. You lose the intimacy of really holding the axe in your hands and bringing it down.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, there's this mechanical quality to it, rather like Foucault talked about, right? It's so impersonal, the guillotine, right? You want something that has a little bit more of a visceral feel to it, like, ugh.
Well, I believe the inventor of the guillotine said this is the most humane way to kill someone because it's basically instantaneous, except you can get a few blinks in before your brain actually shuts off. It's basically instantaneous and painless.
I have no doubt that that's probably true.
So they were trying to make a humane way of murdering the aristocracy.
I mean, that's one of the nice things about being part of the aristocracy, right? Even when people decide to murder you and overthrow the regime you built, there's at least someone there in the corner being like, well, we need to do this in a humane way. They're gentlemen, right? We can't just sit there and hack them up. We've got to make sure that it's done in a nice fashion.
And it's a nice fact that you learn in a history class in grade 11 or 11th grade for our American listeners. But the inventor of the guillotine was himself killed by the guillotine, if I remember correctly.
Oh, isn't that an irony?
Was that he also gave his name to the guillotine too?
Mr. Guillotine?
Yeah.
Is that true? I'm not sure if that's true.
I find that dubious. I find it a dubious claim.
I guess
But we're all about dubious claims here. That's all we do.
I'm just fantasizing about having a method of murder named after me.
I mean, really, what's the most important thing in this situation isn't whether a claim is true or false, but how vigorously and aggressively you can assert it, right? So if Eric wants to stand by his Mr. Guillotine claim and is going to fight for it, then maybe I can be convinced. Who knows?
So this is really what critical theory, and especially online leftism, is about. It's asserting no holds barred, never giving any ground, and posting it on Twitter.
Fuck right.
Yeah.
So in the context that we're bringing up here,
All right.
part of it is joking, of course, but talking about the way that the online left, and maybe the non-online left, discusses the concept of revolution. Because often, I mean, this is my personal observation, the revolution is coming any day now. And first it was Bernie, now it's the police brutality, Black Lives Matter protests. But the revolution is coming any day now. Everybody is about to become aware of their class position, about to achieve class consciousness. And we just have to cross our fingers for a few more days until that happens. It's really a millenniarianism, the messianic age is about to be ushered in. And it always feels like it's right there. I mean, that's my impression. I don't know if you guys have a different.
No, I think that's true, right? I mean, if you look at a lot of contemporary theorists of revolution, they actually connote it in almost exactly those kinds of religious terms. Think about somebody like Alain Badiou, right? Alain Badiou developed this very sophisticated ontology of reality predicated on Kantorian set theory and so on and so forth. But when it comes to something like revolutionary activity, he describes it as an event with a capital E, right? The same way Heidegger capitalized being, right?
Yeah, Heidegger capitalized all his nouns. What up with that, eh?
The event is something that changes the matrix of being in a very fundamental way, and you can show fidelity to it, or you can choose to reject it. I mean, it's very hard not to interpret this except as a kind of religious expression. And indeed, like somebody like Badiou often does draw parallels between himself and the religious orientation of people like St. Paul and so on and so forth. So I think there's a long history we can talk about here in critical theory of revolutionaries thinking about this as a religious occurrence.
And I absolutely knew that Alain Badiou was going to come up in this conversation. So because you name dropped him, Matt, now you have to explain what his theory of revolution is. And we can go from there.
You're an unkind master, I have to say. I'm going to have to fucking revolt against you and your kind of imperatives at this point. But putting it really simply, right, Alain Badiou basically believes that reality is fundamentally incomplete. Unlike people like Hegel or to a certain extent Plato, you could also talk about people like Spinoza, right? We can't talk about reality as a concerted whole. And for Badiou, this has anti-conservative consequences because conservatives are always trying to create a society that's an integrated whole that's sufficiently robust and sufficiently stable so that things are more or less going to last the way that they are for an indefinite period of time. And for Badiou, that's just the wrong way of looking at reality, right? And again, he develops this very complicated ontology based on set theory, a critique of Hegel, and so on and so forth. We won't get into that. But long story short, right, at certain moments, the ideological conceit that there's a stable whole that we call something like society or we call the liberal democratic order is going to be revealed as an incomplete, inconsistent, ontological failure. And there'll be something like revolutionary activity. And in those kind of instances, you have several different ways of reacting to it. And one of the most important for somebody like Alain Badiou is showing fidelity to the event that ruptures the false totality of being, right? And he says there are a few instances where this has occurred throughout history: the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Maoist Revolution, and so on and so forth. And in each of these instances, there was really no going back to the way things were before, not just because our thoughts had changed about things, but because the reality around us had changed.
I can't believe that's your simple version of it. I think I can be much more simple.
Go ahead.
You have a status quo. You have a group of people or a group of ideas that are uncounted in the status quo, such that it seems impossible for those ideas to ever have an effect in the world. Then at some point, almost almost inexplicably, but because of material conditions, suddenly that impossible idea becomes possible, and you have a revolution.
I think that's actually really well put. And again, in a lot of his work on St. Paul, for example, right, he makes this kind of connection really explicit, right? That which has been denied before in the name of the one is now being resurrected or rejuvenated as what stands against the one, right? And disrupts the kind of holism that's being presented. And, he says this is very much a Christian kind of gesture, though, of course, he's not a Christian, right?
And just to put it into context, the idea of uttering the statement, Black Lives Matter, implies Black lives have not mattered until now. So the moment of the now, when this is suddenly a movement that has gained large popular support, it was not conceivable in the same way before Black Lives Matter became an event with a capital E. Could you call Black Lives? I don't want to get into debate over whether or not that's an event or not, but that's the kind of thing Badiou is talking about, that something that can seem impossible at one time ruptures into reality and becomes possible. And
I think Noam Chomsky actually articulated this really well just the other day with Michael Brooks, right? So one of the things Chomsky said is, look, like, if you look at Martin Luther King and the degree of support that the American public and the world public showed to him in the 1950s and 1960s, it was extremely slender, right? If you look at the amount of support people are showing towards Black Lives Matter and toward protests, and particularly towards protests in a time of COVID-19, right? It's tremendous, right? You can't compare the degree of support people showed at Black Lives Matter at this point to what Martin Luther King enjoyed in the 1960s or the 1950s, right?
Even the Black Lives Matter protests just a few years ago, they were not met nearly with the same support. But once you can associate it with this image, obviously someone dying brutally on camera, then it almost makes that event possible just by that image.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, there's no doubt that George Floyd has changed the world in certain fundamental ways. And what's really fascinating about this is exactly what you said, right? I remember just 5 years ago, right, Black Lives Matter was considered a peripheral movement. Mainstream media rejected what they had to say, or they considered them radicals. Now you have people on CNN sitting there not only defending Black Lives Matter, but treating this like it's just a commonsensical kind of reaction to the brutal killing of an innocent person, right? And that's a huge change, right? Whether it's revolutionary, that's something we can talk about, but it's definitely dramatic and visceral.
There's some echoes with the Rodney King beatings and the LA riots going on here too. Most millennials are probably a little too young to remember any of that stuff, but there's a clear connection because the Rodney King beatings were I think it was the first sort of violent crime, police brutality to be caught on video and sort of go viral and really outrage people on a scale that we haven't seen before. So in many ways, today's repeating that event, I guess you could say.
Well, I think a lot of people would say that they hope it doesn't repeat that event, because the thing about Rodney King is people got angry for a little while, and there was like the requisite sympathy and people saying, yeah, we feel bad, and then nothing fundamental really changed, right? And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is whether this is a moment where there is going to be genuine ontological or structural change, right? Is this going to be the moment where the system finally has a test that it's unable to complete, right?
Oh, well, every moment is an incomplete revolution, right? We're doing our best to keep momentum going on these things, and it's this confluence of COVID and the graphic videos of police brutality, Donald Trump being in the White House, economic uncertainty and instability. All these things are coming together.
Or even the the critique of Antifa, right? The fact that literally anti-fascism now is considered a terrorist act.
Yeah, that might have a galvanizing effect on the so-called Antifa groups who are not connected whatsoever.
Well, what do you think about the communist posters, people who post the communism memes, Stalin memes? To them, and every popular uprising, no matter what it's about, to them is about class, or should be about class. What do you think about this being a matter of class, is it, first of all, or is it co-opting something very different, which is not unrelated to class? It's inextricably linked to class in terms of, the establishment of the American state and its racial policies. But to what extent are people that are out there waving flags and placards, to what extent is that a class conscious event?
I think to a certain extent it inexorably is related to class, right? And the thing is, like, there have been killings of innocent black people in the United States before, right? And each of them was horrible, and each of them was awful and deserved people rising up against it, but no one did. And I think when you see the combination of something like COVID-19 really exposing the limitations of the neoliberal order, combined with, frankly, just the frustration that comes with sitting in your house, feeling powerless, knowing that the system is working to support the people at the top and not necessarily working to support the people at the bottom, and then something like this comes along, it's a catalyst for a lot of that outrage. And in fact, what I worry about sometimes is that the specific racial discrimination that was really important initially in this case might actually be lost in the upswell of outrage that's shown justifiably towards the system as a whole, right? I think the cast that we have right now is in some sense maintaining outrage specifically at the kind of racial injustices that took place, while also recognizing that these are part of a bigger systemic set of problems related to neoliberal capitalism.
I think class is one of the best ways to slice things up and look at them, because there's so many lenses you can take, right? You can take a gender lens, you can take a black and white racialized lens, you can look at trans folk versus cisgendered folk. But class, to me, seems to be the most explanatory in a lot of situations, just because I think things seem to fall pretty neatly across class lines. But I mean, there's also a problem with getting too attached to a way of cutting things up like that. Like, you don't just want to look at things like a class war or a war between the proletariat and the ruling class, but it's definitely a useful lens. And I think that some of the other ways of looking at things, maybe they don't divide things up correctly. I mean, there are plenty of feminist men out there, but if you take a really sort of anti-male stance, you lose out. But when you look at things in terms of class, right, it's pretty safe to say that the lower class is oppressed by the upper class, and that it just seems to me a great way of slicing things up. Of course, every situation needs to be treated differently, and we got to be critical of Marxism.
I'm trying to steer this conversation a little bit, but I don't know where I'm steering it to because I don't know the answer to it. So the thing that I'm trying to figure out is, can you call this an event of class consciousness? And just for anybody to catch up, class consciousness is when you're aware of who your oppressor is, and you're aware that you're stronger than them because of either numbers or, in the sense of the Hegelian dialectic of recognition, you realize that, like, I don't have to put up with this shit. We have a definite racial dimension to this. People who want justice, people who think like this is real, or who are only all of a sudden realizing that it's real and saying, okay, now this is not okay because I'm aware of it. And you have intermixed in there some sense of class consciousness saying, this whole order, this whole system is not okay? Or is it an anger directed specifically at this individual video and saying racial injustice like this is not okay?
No, but I would say actually it is a moment of class consciousness. And the reason is that, as Mark Fisher pointed out really elegantly in his book, Capitalist Realism, right? One of the kind of insistent features of the neoliberal racist order that we inhabited for a very long time is that, look, more or less the structures of society are settled. You can try to improve your lot personally by reaching the top of the totem pole in your society, but the fundamental structures of society aren't to be challenged. And he articulated this very well by saying, people insisted in the 1990s that history had come to an end. There were no longer any kind of big struggles that people could engage in, because everything had been settled in favor of neoliberal capitalism. And what we're seeing right now, in some sense, isn't class consciousness in the classical Marxist sense, but a sense that the people have the power to change society in a fundamental way. And they want to change it in a more racially egalitarian dimension. But I also suspect, as you pointed out, that in the long run, this is also going to take on a very clear class dimension. When people realize that you can't dissociate the oppression of African Americans from the oppression of the capitalist system, and they're going to want far more dramatic changes. At least that's what I hope, right? And what this really constitutes for me is a resurgence of the idea that we live in a historical epoch. We can change history. We can transform our society. And this is something that we need to do now, not tomorrow.
But I'm not sure class is ever going to be a basis for any kind of common sense of purpose or consciousness. It just seems like it's changing too quickly. I mean, the emerging proletariat in Marx's time is very different from the working class of our time. And I mean, as we go into the digital age and as things become automated and as technology begins taking more and more jobs than they have before, I mean, class divisions are shifting so quickly that it becomes outmoded to look at the world in terms of just proletariat factory workers versus the owners of the means of production. I mean, that owning group has really, really shrank.
All right. So I'm going to have to grill you on that point because you just said Marx is either wrong or needs to be reconsidered, or Marx missed some aspect of his critique, because that's fundamental. The awareness of your class position is necessary for revolution in the Marxian sense.
I think that though we can reconceive it along the ways that like Fisher and other people are talking about, right? Class consciousness doesn't need to necessarily just be the proletariat against the bourgeoisie and reliant upon these 19th century categories, right? What it can be, and I think Eric put it this really elegantly, and so did you, is just this sense that you have numbers on your side, and it is possible to fundamentally change history for the better, to attain economic and racial justice, right? And that might not be a classically Marxist conception of class consciousness, but I think it is a conception of class consciousness in a more postmodern 21st century sense of the word, right? The notion that we can change history, we can adopt a kind of meta-narrative approach to the world where it can be changed in a very fundamental way. We just need to have the willpower and recognize our strength in order to do so.
Yeah, and I'm not saying Marx is wrong. The essence of the way that he analyzes how history moves, it's just some of the specific predictions he made haven't come to pass, and that was pretty clear even by the time Lenin and Trotsky were writing that Marx had predicted that the revolution would take place in Western Europe among that, and really the first revolution happened in Russia.
I mean, that I do.
That was based on Marxist principles. So we can maintain the essence of what Marx says. We can see whether or not his predictions come to pass, and we can try to take seriously what Marxist revisionists and others have said after Marx, and keep on. No theorist is ever going to have the last word on how history develops and how society changes. That's just not possible. Nobody has that power to see into the future, not even someone as brilliant as Marx was.
All right, so I'm happy about this. We're adding some nuance to the sense of class.
Boom.
And this class that we're talking about, I think in this case, we could talk about it as being the perceived injustice. We might call it discontent in like a Freudian sense even. So if we have this discontent, then we can't specifically think about this in only economic terms. Now, my one worry and the next thing I want to throw at you guys is if we have this discontent and people are burning down Target and burning down Wendy's. By the way, these are great aesthetic signs. I love the image of a Wendy's burning.
All the ice cream just melting out the doors.
But my next point, Rick, referencing back to Marx, would be this is not redistributive at all. This is kind of an expression of discontent, one that is good, one that is probably going to lead to some reforms, but it's not redistributive in the sense of, dealing with the inequality of wealth.
Yeah.
Well, Well, I would actually like to drop on your kind of Freudian reference there and talk about impotent signs of resistance, right? And I'm not using this in a disparaging way to talk about anybody, who's actually just protesting and so on and doesn't expect society to change and suggesting that's bad. I think it actually might be good. But there are always a certain set of mechanisms in place in any given society where people are allowed to protest, sometimes violently, their situation. And they're in place to ensure that they'll protest them, but nothing fundamental will change. Gladiators in like Rome, this idea of like give them bread in circuses and they'll be fine. Or you can think of something like violent sports today, right? Or even something like violent protests in this case. And I think what we really need to see in these circumstances is the transformation of these kinds of violent energies or these radical energies into a more concrete political program that is very specific about what it wants to see changed. And we'll juxtapose what's going on right now to the Occupy Wall Street movement and evoke Slavoj Žižek, as cliche as it is, right? Because Žižek in 2012 said, listen, the biggest problem with the Occupy movement is I would go and talk to these people and I'd ask, what is it that you want? And I'd always just get angry platitudes, right? Like, well, society needs to change, or money should work for people, it shouldn't work for the elites. And we need something a lot more concrete than that in order to succeed this time, right?
Just to go back to one thing you said, your speech pattern and I think your thought process is very rhizomatic. So let's go to the next thing. But when Matt is talking about violent sports, gladiatorial games, and Freud, what he is discussing is thanatos, the death drive, which Freud actually himself didn't mention, but it's a Freudian concept that we crave almost to witness destruction, even our own destruction, as long as we can manage it with the pleasure principle.
Yeah, you've been really into death.
Is that right? I don't want to put words in your mouth. Right. Okay. So
did Freud not actually mention this though? I remember in Civilization and its Discontents, he did bring up the whole thanatos principle and stuff.
I'm pretty sure he never used the word thanatos. He used the word eros, and the opposite in the Greek pantheon would be thanatos. But he didn't mention it. It was called the death drive. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
We can fact check me. I'm saying it very assuredly, self-assuredly, so it must be right.
Not my area.
So we have this beautiful image, this aesthetically lovely image of a Wendy's on fire because someone got shot there, probably by the police, right? I actually didn't check the story.
There's something really effective about an image like that. It is beautifully commonplace. It has that uncanniness of being so familiar, yet there's something off about it too. a broken Wendy's or some fast food joint that's been set on fire.
This is what I want to ask you though, Eric. Quick question though, like you're the semiotics expert. What is it that makes an image powerful? Because a couple of years ago, I remember there was that image of the little girl, in the camps, the one who was separated from her family by Trump and ICE and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was extremely powerful and extremely tragic. But it didn't really mobilize any popular uprising. People weren't outraged by the fact this little girl was treated badly. So what is it that makes an image powerful enough? Like say George Floyd, right? Like, I mean, there's no doubt that seeing him with like a knee on his neck was powerful enough to mobilize people to get angry. What's the distinction between a powerful image and an image that gets people out in the streets?
Yeah, well, there's something parallel with an image and a thought, right? When an image is presented or when a thought occurs to somebody, right? It fires neurons in a certain pattern, and it predisposes you to then think that way in the future as well, because you develop these patterns of thinking. There's something parallel between media and the way that images travel and ideas and the way that ideas travel. And for semiotics, ideas and thoughts are really just signs like images as well. And I guess when you're talking about media theory as well and photography and the sort of the suddenness which an image can be captured and then spread like wildfire on social media circuits nowadays, I mean, it's like one big brain, and we're all hooked together with these neural networks that go into our screens and go between everything. And from a semiotic perspective, it's really interesting, the sort of, you call it maybe a psychophysical parallelism between mind and media.
Yeah. But just go back to like the original topic of conversation, right? What is it that makes an image revolutionary versus an image that just makes people mad? I think is the kind of question I'm asking. Very simply, right? Because looking at a little girl who's been separated from her family because of ICE makes me mad, right? And it made a lot of people mad, right? Looking at an image of a little girl whose body has been racked by napalm in Vietnam made a lot of people mad, almost mad enough to revolt, right? But then you see this image of George Floyd with a knee on his neck. People are out in the streets and they're really, really fucking mad, right? Whether or not this is going to enact revolutionary change, who knows, right? What is it about an image where it hits a certain threshold and it becomes enough, right, to really galvanize people?
Yeah. Are those?
I have a thought about that, and it's a concept that comes from information theory, like Claude Shannon information theory. And the amount of information that a message has is how contrary to expectations it is. So in your Vietnam example, the girl with her clothes burned off because of the napalm bombing, the PR campaign at that time is, we have to stop communism. Our boys are going over there to stop communism. And this is a very abstract sort of force of good and evil, right? So the thought that's going through our public brain, as Eric said, would be, this is all right. They're doing a good thing. But then when you see a little girl with her clothes burned off, from an information theory perspective, this would be shocking. Like, why, if we're combating evil as the good people, then how could a little girl have her clothes burned off? And I think it's the same thing with George Floyd, in the sense that we have a colossus of images of cops being good, cops dealing with criminals, cops that, they're forced into the tough decision in the moment.
TV shows, right? Like Law and Order. I grew up watching that, right?
Yeah.
And every single one of them, there's an evil person who's committed a horrible crime, and the cops are the ones who save the world from them, right?
And pretty much, I don't want to be too crude here with my reduction, but this is white people's interpretation of cops. Like, if you talk to members of communities, Black people in the United States, especially the Indigenous in Canada, I expect that they would be like, yo, it was always like this. You're the ones watching Law and Order. We're the ones being like patted down, stop checked by cops on the street, right? So I think the George Floyd image is just like, there's no plausible deniability here. Like, this is actual cop behavior. And then a lot of people that would never have an interaction with cops like that, they're seeing it for the first time. And I think that's what makes it so arresting.
I think that's really smart. And I don't actually have anything to add to that, because I think it sounds right. It's the juxtaposition between expectations and the kind of galvanizing material reality of that image, really, that makes it just shocking and upsetting, right?
Yeah, there is something shocking about those images. Yeah, they achieve a emotional intensity, and the way especially the way our culture is so visual today, they become almost like statements in a conversation, and they're extremely emotionally charged. And in a way, it vindicates certain groups of people, right? Like in the Vietnam example, there were anti-war protesters already. And so people's, I guess their brains were being wired to look for anything that was unjust about this war. And that image really just galvanized that. It crossed the threshold and the synapse happened, that injustice. And they become icons, or what I would rather call them symbols. They become symbols because they become associated with injustices of capitalism, injustices of Western democracies and imperialism.
And we could go through the list, right? It's like the girl from the Vietnam War, the guy with the gun held to his head right before he was shot.
Yeah, the Tiananmen Square.
The prison photos in Iraq would be another example of that.
I go back even further, though. To take a Phil Badiouian point here, think about the image of Jesus on the cross, right? There's a reason this image has resonated for centuries, right? You have somebody who's a total innocent, and he's now being crucified by the state, right? And that galvanizes people and it makes them angry. And I suspect that the power of that kind of imagery is at least part of the reason why you see radical leftist Maoists like Alain Badiou invoking the tradition to this day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I tried to evoke like the cultural readiness to interpret these images in a certain way as well, because these images become like a code, and we have the key to decode them. And when we decode them in terms of the need for radical action, the need for social justice. They become symbols of these movements. So the content of the image becomes less important than the statement that the image makes symbolically. You could say with Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian theorist of media, that the medium is the message in that case, because the content of the image is not so important as what the image then comes to represent in an external fashion as well. And that emotional intensity sometimes stays with it, though. So you combine the emotional intensity of the image with the urgency of the greater movement, the greater cultural consciousness that the image becomes a part of.
Yeah, I mean, I had an argument with a conservative friend of mine, right, from back in Stittsville, right? And he said, well, things weren't as bad as things are portrayed, and, the cops aren't always as, draconian as they're portrayed. And I was like, yeah, it's probably partially true. But I was like, look, if you think about seminal moments in history where things really changed, and what I pointed to was the Arab Spring, right, in 2011. The Arab Spring was initiated by a random dude who was just upset that he wasn't allowed to sell his fruit in the Tunis Square. And he lit himself on fire at the injustice of this, because he had to pay a bribe in order to sell his fruit. And a huge part of the world erupted in anger, right? And it's not because everybody is sitting there concerned, like, well, will I be able to sell my fruit in the square of my city now? This is injustice and so forth. But it's because it represented something that went beyond what it actually immediately stood for, right? Which is, I guess, what we're all kind of talking about in a roundabout way, right? Which is how determinate can these kind of images be? And one of the things I want to ask is it possible to over-determine this image, right? To give it not too much significance, but to kind of lose sight of what actually happened by making it the focal point of all kinds of anxieties and concerns that aren't actually related to George Floyd and his passing.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern.
I have a point that I think unites the entire discussion thus far. So we start with Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou says these events that come from zero, they come from a null, they seem accidental. And the point of these images appear to have caused the entire apparatus to basically collapse in on itself, or, the revolutionary event to have occurred. But the point is that this was a long time coming. There was no way of predicting which image it's going to be or at which time it's going to be. But the whole point of the George Floyd event is that it's almost nothing to do with George Floyd. It's to the police being funded or overfunded, police having this certain mentality that they do, especially in inner city United States, that the members of the community are not actually policing the community. They're coming from outside, that police see themselves as, heroes that are they're not serving and protecting. They're basically enacting instruments of discipline on people. So the George Floyd event is not the thing that made all of this happen. All of that other stuff, the material conditions, we could call it too. I hate using that word flippantly, but the material conditions is what made this happen. And this is basically the event that makes everybody, if we're going to refer back to what Eric said about this collective brain, that's what makes the collective brain realize everything that's been happening all along.
This is what I want to push back against a bit in a kind of weird way, though, because I'm totally for changing the system in very dramatic, fundamental ways, right? I think there should be revolutionary activity, nonviolent revolutionary activity against the system, and so on and so forth. But what I worry about, right, is that the individual George Floyd and the kind of hell that he went through in the moments before he died will get lost in all the kind of morass that's going on about this, right? Because it's very possible that in these kind of situations, right, the initial set of concerns for some dude who was just going to probably buy a couple of groceries and was hassled by the police and he wanted a better life for his family and so on, all that gets lost in the kind of grand set of concerns that come to be associated with this, right?
But so, Matt, wouldn't he have been just forgotten anyway? He never would have become an individual in the sense that he's become now if he hadn't been brutally murdered in the middle of the street on camera.
Well, that's what I mean, right? I mean, I looked at the guy, right? And he had a troubled past, right? Like, he spent some time with drugs. He was in jail. He went to church. He tried to reform himself. He had a daughter. He seemed like a pretty normal guy in a lot of ways, right? Up and downs in his life, a couple of problems, a couple of successes, just trying to make his way through things, right? And he certainly wasn't the kind of person from everything that I've looked at who wanted to be the figurehead for a revolutionary movement. And that's fine. Not everybody needs to be. What I'm saying here is, how do we look at this image as something that will galvanize a revolution without dehumanizing the person who's at the center of it and dissociating from their individuality and their specific history? Because I don't think George Floyd should be forgotten in this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean,
right? That's what I'm kind of concerned about.
He would have been dehumanized. He would have been forgotten anyway. Which is,
but then there's an irony, right, where he becomes basically the figurehead for a movement that he himself would never have recognized, which isn't really all that different from what happened to him directly.
Well, we're all going to live in, most of us are going to live and die with nobody outside of your immediate family even giving a shit in the first place.
Well, think again about the image being a sign, right, in the semiotic sense. And as soon as this George Floyd thing broke, right, we all looked to how do we interpret this? So we start looking for authorities. We look for the guy's brother. We look for people in the media to explain what's happening to us, and we start to ask questions. What does this mean? What does this mean? And when we're talking about Badiou, doesn't he have this concept of fidelity to an event? Isn't that's something important, right? And
well, we
fidelity in this context means faithfulness, which means, I guess, throwing your belief in something. Kierkegaard would be the example that immediately comes to mind. Fidelity to an event means believing in the event, not knowing what it will accomplish.
Yeah, this is all one big event. It seems like this racial injustice, this coronavirus, this horrible presidency, all of this is like one event and the way to honor the memory is to maintain fidelity to that event until the day we die, basically. There is always the danger of losing the specificity, right? Like even Nietzsche talks about this in terms of metaphors and symbols, right? You always lose that initial moment that creates the idea, and the idea then gets detached from its sensory basis and becomes something like a symbol, detached from any concrete reality, but it's still meaningful in that way. It's still coded culturally. And so, it's almost inevitable.
No, I think you're right.
This is the null that exists here. It's the only reason that George Floyd becomes an individual in this event is because it was caught on camera. Because how many people were killed off camera and then they file it as, oh, this person accidentally stopped breathing because they had drugs in their system or whatever it is. It's all the null voices that have been, abjected from the whole system of signs that makes George Floyd this sign. No?
Yeah, but this is actually one of the points where I'd actually try to stress the material reality of his existence, right? And the importance of a Marxist approach to this as opposed to a more postmodern one, right? Because George Floyd wasn't just a sign in a world of signs that happened to be the kind of right image to galvanize people at a given time where a lot of people felt frustration, right? He was a living, breathing person who had a lot of day-to-day concerns that all of us can really empathize with. And he had his ups and downs in life and so on and so forth. But I think it's important not to forget that, right? If we're going to maintain an ethical core or a moral core to this kind of enterprise and realize that what we're trying to do isn't to just change the system, but to make it better for living, breathing, material people who have a lot of concerns and who are fucked up by the system in a way that's very similar to how George Floyd was fucked up.
I think we're saying the same thing, but I'm not sure. My point is that there's thousands of George Floyds every year. So are you saying, oh, we should remember George Floyd's hopes and dreams? Like, sure, okay, there's no harm in that. But the reason that...
Yeah, that's very individualistic to remember the man behind the image. And I mean, I'm sure all the people who are close to him are going to be doing that. But for the rest of them who don't know him, and for us, who he's really got the same status as an idea or an image for us, something that's sort of unreal or hyper real, right? There's no reality behind the image, and that's what he is for a lot of us. And as long as we maintain this fidelity to the event or this solidarity with the movement, we are in a way doing what we can to honor him. And I mean, it's the danger of becoming a martyr, right? You lose the specificity of your own existence and you become part of a greater cause. You become a modern day Joan of Arc or something like that, right? You're made into a martyr, and that's what happens. That's almost inevitable, that ideas lose the specificity where they came from, but they maintain their power. And that initial emotional charge is what's going to give it that extra power to spread and mobilize people to go out and make change and take action, right?
No, I think that's really smart, Eric. I mean, yeah, I think that's right.
I'd like to shift this in general then, because this was sort of the crux that I was going for with my prodding questions. If we look at a leftist project, not just, let's go kill billionaires, but let's create media, let's create means of conversation, even to reference one of my own YouTube videos that I made with Mikey Watson over in Finland, to create a minor vocabulary, which is a Deleuzian term, to create a language that exists outside of the dominant structure. And in this sense, what you're building, and this gets really far away from this individualized view of what action is, but to have a broad view saying, you know what, if we're looking for communism, if we want communism, and that would be like the end goal, that might not happen for 300 years. Are you still going to commit to it, knowing that you're going to die, never having seen the thing that you're hoping for? Or is there a purpose to, as we said, pay fidelity, be faithful to the idea of revolution, despite the fact that you're never going to see it occur?
Well, I think the kind of dialectical point that somebody would make would be that you don't necessarily need to achieve full communism, because you're never actually going to inhabit that kind of perfect state, right? It's foolish to expect that what we're all moving towards is some kind of end state, and that's what the meaning of history is, right? It's not the end goal, it's the process, right? The continuous improvement that we make via our civilization, where people become a little bit more free, able to express their identity, able to form reflective identities that are recognized by others, and so on and so forth. So what I would say to that is, yeah, there's no such thing as utopia at the end of the line, because what we need to try to achieve is the best possible society that we can at any given time. And that doesn't mean that you're going to live in the best possible society that ever will be, but you should try to live in the best possible society that is available to you given the historical conditions in which you live. And I think that's a more dialectical kind of point, right?
I think the difference with communism and, say, social democracy, or someone who's a liberal, a social liberal, is they're both looking for the same end state, right? Socialism / communism, but how they get there, how we get there, and how we maintain that state, they have different ideas about, right? Like someone like Trotsky, who would write that what we need is almost a permanent revolution. We need to put a revolution in place, and it needs to be, maybe this actually echoes with Badiou's idea of maintaining faithfulness to the event, to the revolution. It needs to be put in place, and it needs to be maintained. It's not like we just crossed some threshold into some kind of utopian society, right? And with liberal socialism, it's more of a democratic deliberative process. It's more of a change through gradual steps and reform, rather than anything as radical as a revolution or an overthrow or anything like that.
I mean anything in this I don't mean communism at all or ever, like we're certainly going to get there. But my sense of it is that there's not a collectivist mindset pretty much anywhere that says, if this would happen in 300 years and I take 1 inch by making an individual decision for myself right now, saying, I'm going to respond to this other person in this way rather than this way, because I think this might happen in 300 years. Would that be a good way to think about revolution in a very conceptual sense? Yes, but as a concept, not that you are just your actions now matter because of your fidelity to the event that you'll never see occur.
No, I don't actually think that's a very useful way of thinking about things. And this is one of the reasons I've criticized Badiou to a certain extent, right? With this kind of anti-materialist religiosity that appears in some strands of his work. Because I feel that talking about a quasi-utopian society that'll appear 300 years from now isn't a very useful way of talking about things. I actually much prefer Bhaskar Sunkara, the editor of Jacobin's approach to things, which is what we should be talking about is what will the world look like 5 minutes after capitalism ends, right? And he says, well, if you want to know what the world would look like 5 minutes after capitalism ends, take a look at the Nordic states, right? The social democracies in Northern Europe. We would take that as a kind of foundation point. We would make them a little bit more democratic. We would push egalitarianism a little bit further. There would still be major problems in the world. There'd still be inequities. There'd still be capitalist states that pushed against this, but things would improve for a lot of people. And I think that's a much more practical and much more useful way of looking at things than saying, well, 300 years from now, your great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to benefit from your efforts, right? Because it's something tangible, and it also relates to real-world empirical examples that people can look to and say, well, if we can achieve Sweden, then we can go a little bit beyond Sweden. And maybe by the time that I'm 70, we'll see not just 5 minutes after capitalism, but 10 minutes after capitalism. And I think that's the right way to look at it. So
you're totally fine with the incremental reformist take on things rather than maybe the revolutionary state that Badiou would talk about in terms of the event?
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily anti-revolutionary, right? Because I think there are always going to be hostile forces that resist even the slightest change. I mean, this is fundamentally what we're seeing right now with the reactionary pushback against the globe. And these people are not going to cede power willingly, right? It's going to take tremendous amounts of popular support in order to get them to give an inch, precisely because they've taken a mile for the last 40 years or so via neoliberal reforms. So we're going to need major efforts just to get to Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Canada, the United States, and most of the other Western democracies, right? To get to 5 minutes past capitalism, God only knows what we're going to need to be able to do.
So you're for a slow grind, but still committing to an ultimate end goal of utopia, even if we don't see it.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by utopia, right? I mean, I think that politics isn't everything, right? And this is kind of where Kierkegaard's injunction becomes really important, right? I mean, you could have a society where almost all your material needs are met, where there's no exploitation, where the environment is maintained in a reasonably rational manner, right? And you can still have problems with your wife, problems with your girlfriend, problems with your boyfriend, whatever it happens to be, because you don't know whether you want to have kids or not, right? Is that a utopia? Well, I'd say that it is in a certain sense, because most people are relieved from the burdens of necessity that most of human beings have suffered through over the course of our history. But that doesn't mean that everyone's happy and everyone's content, right? There'll still be problems. But these are problems that are no longer the purview of politics or political economy, or even environmental concerns, right?
And Eric, speaking of environmental concerns, what would you think? Is this a state of constant revolution, or is it a grind, or is it fidelity to an event for you?
Are those my three options?
Or no, provide me a third. Those are the three that are on the table.
No, I mean, I don't know if I can really outline an option, but I can push back and say, like, even before I even talk about what we need to do with regards to the environment and ecology and biodiversity and the increasing number of viruses that we're seeing, revolution is always urgent, right? Any moment that there's suffering in the world is a moment that calls for a revolution. And I mean, if I'm going to be a good Marxist and push back against you sort of lazy social liberals who think we can get there through reform and incremental change.
Did
right?
you just call him a lazy social liberal?
Yeah. Like, you don't want to go out
fired.
and change things because no, but for there's a certain urgency, right? Like, if there's going to be a revolution in the future, if we think that's needed, then it's always already needed now, because there is suffering now, right? Like, what about that example you're talking about? If you're fighting with your girlfriend about certain things, and the utopian state is to be not fighting anymore and have a kid and be happy.
Well, no, I want to say I don't think that's the utopian state, right? I think there's no way of relieving interpersonal problems through political economic change, fundamentally, right? I think we could actually alleviate a lot of the concerns that people have at a personal level by creating a more egalitarian society where people's dignity is respected, everyone has the resources to lead a rich, flourishing life the way that they wish, and where their environment was respected, and so on and so forth. But I think this is something that every great novelist has intuited, and other philosophers interiority have also talked about. People like Kierkegaard, or even Sartre in some of his less Marxist moments, right? There'll still be personal problems that we have, right? If you and your girlfriend want to have a baby, or your wife, right? And you have all the money in the world to do so, but you don't know whether you're ready to be a father, that's not necessarily something that's political in the sense that we're talking about it. Say we have a future where the genders are equal and so on and so forth, right? That's a personal choice that you have to make. And it can be a very difficult choice, and it might mean that there's going to be some unhappiness down the line if you make the wrong one, right?
Matt, is there anything you want to tell us?
I was thinking of
in
it
your
more
slow
as an
burn
analogy.
of fighting with your girlfriend, though, is there any place for the burning Wendy's? Because I'm not willing to live in a world without that burning Wendy's picture.
I was looking at it as more of an analogy. Like, if you're fighting with your girlfriend and you live in a building with other people and you're yelling at each other is affecting them, that's a little bit like the need for revolution right now, is we're all going about our lives happy that with incremental change, while there's people right now in abject poverty, suffering. There's people, there's child and women slaves, and also men being sold as slaves as well. Like, all of that stuff calls for a revolution right now, but we think we can get there sometime in the future. I mean, what's the thing, like Walter Benjamin, the great Marxist, always says, is that every moment is a window through which the Messiah might come and save us from history, sort of thing, right? And that's what we need. Every moment has to be that possible moment where the revolution begins, not later, definitely not through democratic political institutional systems, but I guess you're right in saying maybe it's got to come from outside of those things, society and politics.
Well, I'm surprised we made it this far as a bunch of philosophy dorks talking about revolution from our computers, but we haven't yet brought up the Hegelian, sorry, Freudian slip. The Zizekian doctrine, don't try to change the world, just try to think about it. I'm paraphrasing, and I think I might have gotten it wrong, but...
we've changed the world. Now it's time to step back and think.
We've changed the world, so now sit on your computers and tweet about...
Which harkens back
Ezra
to the
Klein.
Marxist principle. The philosophers has interpreted the world. Now we have to change it. Now Zizek is inverting that.
I think that it's like a false juxtaposition to actually suggest that the two are fundamentally different, right? And the reason is because here I agree with somebody like Theodore Adorno, right? Like, what we really need to overcome at this kind of juncture is the tyranny of reality, right? Or the tyranny of the positive and the given. And that's because a lot of people out there, reactionaries like Jordan Peterson or the people at the National Review, are going to insist that this is just the way that the world is. It's the way it's always been. You can't fundamentally change it, right? And I think in order to recognize that the world is malleable and can be pushed in a more just direction, exactly like Eric was talking about, right? We need to realize that the way things are right now isn't the way things have to be. And And that requires a conscious act before it generates revolutionary activity, right? You need to think that the society you live in isn't permanent. You need to recognize that the kind of history that you live in is lived and not just inherited. And it's not an easy thing to do, right? So I think that there's a fundamental connection between action and thought in a way that kind of eschews this binary.
I'm glad that you said that, because I haven't given my take on this yet. So here it is, unsolicited, because we're about at an hour now. But my thought is, when something like Bernie happens, or when something like BLM happens, then don't just give your assent to it, give your body to it if you can, go out. But when nothing's happening, that doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. We don't just sit on our ass and, take the black pill, wait for whatever accelerationist world to appear for us. So in the meantime, do your thinking, do your writing, do your creating. Maybe you create a form, like this podcast, for example. We're basically, filling in the form, but maybe a better example is YouTube videos that are educational. That's not a space that has been completed yet. So maybe that's something that I can do. Matt, with your writing. Eric, creating a concept. You're trying to unite ecological criticism with semiotics. So
that's my strategy mainly. Don't listen to my words. Look at my body.
I mean, ultimately, it sounds really resigned. But at the end of the novel Candide, Voltaire, Candide's running around the world trying to figure out, is this the best of all possible worlds, with Pangloss, who represents Leibniz in this context. But he's going everywhere trying to figure out, is this the best of all possible worlds? And he gets so tired out. By
really horrible stuff happens to him all the time.
His girlfriend is raped. Killed. I think she comes back to life at one point.
And he's like, well, it's the best of all possible worlds, so I guess I should be happy.
I should be happy. But then the last page of that book, Leibniz, Pangloss, says to him, so, have I convinced you? Is this the best of all possible worlds? And Candide says, il faut cultiver le jardin, or something. I'm just working my garden. One must do his garden. And then Pangloss says again, well, is it the best possible world or not? And Candide says to him, one must do his garden. That's it. He's not going to reflect on, the cosmology of the universe, the ontology of the universe. He's just going to do his own thing. So I think, go do your own thing. Make something. Work with your hands. Do the Heideggerian Dasein, Handlichkeit thing. Just chill out.
I must say, I plug my appraisal of Zizek. I think I completely agree with Zizek. I think that revolutions start with a change in our perception and the way we see the world, and then it leads to action. I mean, capitalism, since in the Industrial Revolution, we've basically been in a constant state of revolution, right down to the little things of whether or not we should breastfeed our kids, right up to the biggest thing of how to manage a multi-million population democracies. And we're in a state of constant revolution all the time. There's no need to talk about the changing material, social, and economic conditions, because those are always changing. We need to get a handle on this intellectually and with concepts, and then we need to act. We have definitely changed the world so much since Marx said the original quote that I think Zizek is right to turn it around. And when I think about climate change, well, yeah, we have changed the climate of the world. And I don't know about the tyranny of the real, but my definition of the real is quite conservative, I guess. It's just whatever is what it is, whether or not we think about it. That's really as far as my definition of the real goes. I don't think there's anything real outside of thought.
You're back up in Aristotle there.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm in my semiotics. It's not important, but I have a certain version of realism that I look to, and And that's it, right? And the climate is one of those things that doesn't give a shit what we think about it. Yeah, of course the world is malleable, but there are many tipping points and breaking points that don't give a shit whether or not we have the best of intentions when we do what we do. Those things are going to change, and not always for the better. We have our social systems set up in certain ways, and the way the climate and the earth decides to respond to what we do is not going to take into account whether or not we want an endless supply of hamburgers and Wendy's soft serve ice cream. It's not going to care about that. It's going to care about phosphorus cycles and nitrogen cycles and fresh water cycles, right? It doesn't give a shit about what we think of it. And that's basically as far as my realism goes. I don't go into naive realism where the world is the way I see it. That's actually ideology. That's a totally different thing.
All right, so for final thoughts, the question of the episode was, is revolution a worthwhile concept? And I'm going to throw it to you, Matt. What do you think based on our discussion? Have you learned anything, first of all?
I did, actually, and I'm really happy that Eric reminded me about that Zizekian point, because it's something that I'm not always as cognizant of as I should be, right? The fact that reality is fundamentally not hostile, but indifferent, right? It doesn't care, and we need to appraise ourselves and recognize that a lot of the conceits that we have right now are centered around the idea that we are at the epicenter of creation and the world must revolve around us. And ontologically, the world is going to work itself out because otherwise we'd be disappointed. And that's just not the way things are, right? We're a really weird species that evolved at a very idiosyncratic time. We were fortunate enough to develop civilization, but it could all too easily be ruined by our failure to actually acknowledge the damage that we're doing to other planets. So thank you, Eric. That was something that I learned, and it's something that I need to be more attentive to in the future. So yeah, big thumbs up there.
But final thoughts on revolution?
Final thoughts on revolution. I absolutely do think that we need a revolution right now. Whether that needs to be a violent revolution, I think that really depends on the context. But I think that globally what we need is a revolution in our thinking about things, to kind of reference the theme generally, where we realize that people who talk about the end of history or say that this cannot be done are invoking a false sense of the world. The world is not infinitely plastic, but very, very open to recreation. And there are huge problems right now, probably more problems than we've seen in many generations. And we need to have the willpower and the creativity to deal with these things by changing things in a fundamental manner, not allowing ourselves the luxury of just assuming that they'll work out as long as we continue on what is ultimately a barren path.
And of course, we want to say that thought matters because that's what we're trying to get paid for. So even if sitting on our asses is, we'll try to justify it no matter what. So you probably shouldn't take our word on that. Eric, any final thoughts? Are you still with just dreaming John Lennon dreams?
No, I don't think I would use the John Lennon approach to revolution. No, I think I learned a lot about Badiou and also about how to bring my semiotics to politics, really. One of my favorite characters of any television show I've ever watched is Britta from Community. She is the paradigmatic revolutionary, completely naive, completely clueless about how the world works, but just so true of heart and genuine in everything she does. And she's right all the time, but nobody acknowledges her. Go back out and watch that episode, the one about the Meow Meow Beans, where everyone gets a rating from 1 to 5. You can rate teachers, and the 5s come to dominate everything. And then Britta begins the revolution of the 1s, right? And the 1s take over and reduce all the filthy 5s to oneness as well. And that's one of my favorite episodes. That's what I'm going to take out of this. And also fidelity to an image, I think, is more important than fidelity to an event. Because an event is something that's already passed by the time it occurs, but an image keeps on moving. An images think for us as well. We can think with these images too.
Well, the event can be an image concept with a dash between. So If you have been interested in what we're talking about today, the book that I was referencing, I hope that Matt and I were referencing the same Alain Badiou book, but it was Being an Event. That's where he does the fourfold, right?
Yeah, that one and Conditions are probably where he lays out his theory of ontology and revolution, along with metapolitics most clearly.
All right, so your reading list today, if you're interested in anything that we've blabbed on about, again, unsolicited, would be Being an Event, and then I guess, anything else?
And go watch Community. Check out the Meow Meow Beans episode.
Watch Community Season 5, it's true. You'll thank us once you're done.
Yeah, Dan Harmon's back for Season 5.
No, Season 5 is good. Season 4 is the shit one.
Oh, I only got up to 3, so I never...
5 and 6 are beautiful. Dan Harmon's back in the game, and he does a great job.
Anyways, guys, thanks for the talk. Go have your party and constantly reflect upon revolution.
Yeah.
And I would say be careful of cops, but you waspy motherfuckers don't have to worry about that at all. So. All right. Peace.
Signing out.